Hong Kong tells us a lot about the protest. It tells us a lot about the numbers. It tells us a lot about the creativity. It tells us a lot why tactics of concentration are not the only resort you should be reclining on. Sometimes it is the tactics of dispersion that work better, but also reminds us on the key principles of success: unity, planning, and nonviolent discipline. Obviously, there is a violent flank of the movement in Hong Kong, and obviously that violent flank hurts both the movement's reputation and participation, which decreased since the violent flank of the movement took over. So for the successful movement, you need to maintain nonviolent discipline, where you preach it, teach it, or build it through training, and you need to disfranchise yourself from the violent flanks of the movement. This is how you keep the momentum. This is how you keep numbers, and this is what we should be looking at now in Hong Kong. If the protesters organize themselves the way they can tackle nonviolent discipline, then the protest will sustain. If the protesters slip into supporting the violent wing, then the numbers will dwindle, and also the opponent will have the excuse for using violence and repression, which already happens.
Indeed. You also argue that the goals have to be meaningful to everyday people. Do you think they are now pushing for too much?
I think when you take a look at successful movements, and this is outlined in our book and 13 years of canvas work, everything starts with a vision. So what is the different reality that will happen if the movement wins? And I think demands of the movement are pretty clear, and there should be some kind of order of the battle in terms of what small victories movements achieve at which stage of the movement. Obviously, if you take a look at the case of Hong Kong, the law is scrapped, and now there are more demands for independent investigation into police violence. But you don't gain independent investigation into police violence by being violent. And I think this is the big problem that the movement in Hong Kong now faces, aside of the fact that this is a David facing Goliath in terms of numbers and the resources. There were cases in history, including Serbian nonviolent movement, which I helped founded, where David won against the Goliath. The thing is to take a look at the tangible victories, to build unity, but also to maintain nonviolent discipline throughout the process.
Let's take a look at Lebanon, where they've used a lot of humour and non-traditional protests. How effective can that be?
Humor keeps the festive atmosphere. Humor keeps numbers growing. Humor also breaks fear and apathy, and humor also puts your opponent between the rock and a hard place. If your opponent responds violently to the prank, they look stupid. If they, however, don't respond, they look weak. And this is the magic of the thing we call loftivism, very well exercised in Lebanon. Together with Iraq, however, where we also have a stray of protests, Lebanon is significant because of the two reasons. First of all, it is kind of the fragile democracy, so you have kind of elections there, but it seems that the state built along the sectarian functions and sectarian felds just don't tend to hold on. And people are now aiming for something completely different, and we may be witnessing the new era of how the Lebanon, or in a longer shot, Iran, is structured, because obviously this artificial state is not delivering. It is corrupt, it is inefficient, and it makes a lot of people sidelined from the mainland politics. Another very interesting thing would be how the world will react. Same as in Hong Kong, where we have a main player in China. Lebanon and Iraq impact the region very much, especially the Iranian influence in the region. And we know Iran is allergic to the nonviolent movement since the crackdown on a revolution in 2009. So we'll see how this play out, but we need to take a look at the watchful eye. We have amazing example in the neighborhood, Sudan. Ousted a 30-year-old dictator. They maintain in something that the Egyptians failed, which is overcoming the coup, which came afterwards. So the whole North Africa and Arab world region is experiencing amazing stray of protest. It is also the role of youth and participation of women who participate in these protests in unprecedented numbers that we want to look at. Successful movements need numbers, but they also need diversity. So Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, they're all amazing examples of how the world can be changing by a simple people.
Many of the very successful movements of the early Arab Spring have not gone on to have sustained success. We look at Turkey, Egypt, Syria, just brutal crackdowns. How do they sustain?
Well, first of all, how do they fail? 20% of our university courses, and you can see I'm sitting in the university, 20% of our workshops and probably half of my book looks at why movements fail. It's great to learn from positive examples, but we also need to learn from examples like Egypt. Scientifically, majority of the movements are capable to achieving some of their goals. In fact, more than half of the nonviolent movements achieve their goals. Less than 40% sustain these goals. So it is the victory phase, it is institutionalizing this change where the movements fail. And what happened in Egypt, for example, is that protesters proclaimed game over too early in the process. B, their goal was to remove Mubarak, not to reform Egypt. They were successful in removing Mubarak. And then they leave the democratic transition in the hands of military and Muslim Brotherhood, those two very undemocratic institutions. And of course, we see the result. Result is Sisi, who is actually less democratic than the Mubarak was. If you take a look in Sudan, for example, you see the value of understanding where the game over is. Game over is not when the dictator steps down. Game over is when you reform the society. You also see how effectively they apply the principles from Gene Sharp anti-coup book, which means that if after the dictator the military steps in, you want to deprive military from both obedience of the population and international and domestic recognition. If you deny putschists these two things, they will be likely to cooperate and share power, which is exactly what happened in Lebanon. So we can look at these things and say, oh, this is random. No, this is not random. Successful revolutions need unity, planning, and nonviolent discipline. Successful revolutions need a long-term vision. And successful revolution needs to learn how to maintain momentum in order to make this large change not only possible, but also durable and a new normal, if you want, for the next generations.